This time, Brunelleschi was forced to supervise the project with his co-engineer and rival, Ghiberti. Now, with material for the placement of the chains pouring in, he would seize the opportunity to move Ghiberti out.
In August of 1423, Brunelleschi called in sick. Ghiberti rather reluctantly then begins the direction of the placement of these wooden chains. And as soon as Brunelleschi heard that the process had begun, he miraculously recovers, inspects the quality of Ghiberti's work, and criticizes it publicly, saying they would have to undo everything that he had done.
With Ghiberti sufficiently humiliated, Brunelleschi was declared the head of the project for life. On August 30th, 1436, after 16 years of construction, the largest masonry dome in the world was completed. But Brunelleschi's career was far from over. Even before the completion of the Duomo, he had been experimenting with perspective and mathematical proportions. Although his structures appeared simple and straightforward in design, there were spatial games being played with the lines of buildings. And one of Brunelleschi's greatest innovations was a concept that is still a cornerstone of engineering today: single-point perspective. By looking at this 8-sided baptistry and the other buildings surrounding it, Brunelleschi realized if he placed 3-dimensional buildings on a 2-dimensional plane, they would disappear at a finite point, called the vanishing point. This idea that the apparent size of an object would decrease with increasing distance from the eye would transform the entire landscape for artists and architects around the world, allowing the concept of the blueprint to emerge.
What it does in architecture is change the game all the way through Frank Lloyd Wright and to Frank Gehry today. Because architecture is no more just building. It isn't figuring it out in the dirt and saying, hey, if this wall is that long, we got to make the spire that high. Now they can deduce it and put it on paper. It's no longer the builder who's in control, it's the architect.
Before Brunelleschi, most projects were based on approximate models. This would come to an end when Brunelleschi began this practice of what we call paper architecture, and that is clearly indicating what his plans were, and then begins the sort of modern tradition of architecture today.
Brunelleschi's radical new designs would be put to the test in 1442 in his construction of the Pazzi Chapel.
Now this building behind me is the chapter house for the Church of Santa Croce, a Franciscan church. It's called the Pazzi Chapel. I'm going to talk to a man I'm a little nervous talking to. He's one of my own professors from Syracuse University, Dr. Rab Hatfield, and he's going to explain why this chapel is distinct from what Brunelleschi was doing before this. Let's go look on the inside.
Let's go see them. It's all about relationships. He's trying to figure out an arrangement of all of these pieces so they all fit together perfectly, just the way the bones all fit together in your body.
Right.
Your Renaissance architect, thanks to the invention of scientific perspective, where they learn how to represent space, and it's Brunelleschi who invents this, learn to see things in 3D, learn to imagine things in 3D.
Rather than flying by the seat of your pants, you start with a concept and you follow the concept to its fruition in perfection.
And I think you get a very good sense of that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's spatial magic.
Brunelleschi's innovations in design and construction techniques would be emulated by architects for centuries. But a new era was dawning in the age of architects. Neighboring powers rekindled old rivalries. And artists who had turned into architects and engineers would now be drafted into a new kind of public service. Now they'd turn their creative thinking to the art of war. Brunelleschi used more than 4 million bricks in the construction of the dome. 1459. Filippo Brunelleschi has become the father of Renaissance architecture, making Florence a mecca for innovations in design and construction. Now his methods and ideas spread beyond his republic, as architects throughout the region would launch ambitious building campaigns.
Filippo Brunelleschi transforms all of architectural design by using Roman elements like this column and pilasters and numerical proportions, integrating them into an elegant and beautiful whole that is never overwhelmed by one of the parts. But he doesn't write it down. It's up to a young guy, the next generation, Leon Battista Alberti. This guy did everything. He wrote about archaeology, political science, religion, even wrote about horseback riding. He's a pretty good designer and architect himself. Now, everyone starts to read about Alberti, including a very powerful guy at the moment, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini. I love that name, Aeneas Silvius. So for all you guys out there like me having a little bit of a heart attack because your wife just said, honey, let's redecorate, get a load of this. Pius reads Alberti and says, you know, I'd like to do that little Roman thing for the place where I was born. What, the house? No, the whole town.
Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini became Pope Pius II in 1458. By 1459, he had turned his attention to his hometown of Corsignano and commissioned a first attempt at constructing an ideal city.
This is the Tuscan town of Pienza. And this is my friend and a guy who taught me, Rocky Ruggiero from Syracuse University. I want to ask you first, is this the first real Renaissance town that's planned as such?
To come to this backwater town where, you know, population is a couple of hundred people, it kind of gives Pius free rein. So what he does is to create this rather imposing cathedral. And it's that first impression that you get. And then around this particular structure, he will organize all of the other various archetypes.
If this piazza is so perfectly planned with its perfect bishop's palace and its cathedral, why are these streets always crooked? I come up here, I don't know where I'm going.
This is actually done intentionally. One thing they didn't want to do was to let people know how small it was. And so they intentionally keep these streets from forming a direct axis so that you always have a corner that's sort of obstructing your view, and it makes it seem much larger than it actually is.
By the time the transformation was complete in 1464, more than 40 buildings had been constructed or refurbished. Each on its own was an important expression of revolutionary ideals. But it was the town as a whole that represented everything the age stood for. And yet the harmonious feeling in Pienza would not last long. The radical new ideals that glorified man and human potential were being challenged.
The year is 1492. Not only has Columbus discovered America, but Lorenzo the Magnificent de' Medici, the great patron of the arts in Florence, is dead. But a lot of Florence is sick of the Medicis and their cronyism, and they want the Medici kids run out of town. Plus, they've been listening to the sermons of a small Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola, who preaches from the pulpit in the Duomo, railing against corruption in both church and state. He advocates a return to a Florentine republic and civic pride and values through piety. Savonarola warns that if Florence doesn't get its house in order, the winds of God's vengeance will blow through the city, and indeed an evil wind is ready to roll all the way through Italy in the form of Charles VIII of France, who wants to reclaim Naples in the name of his country and threatens to sack any Italian town who stands in his way.
Savonarola begins to predict an invasion of some sort. And when it finally comes, he's able to say, you see, I predicted this, I foretold it. He's able to kind of pass himself off as a prophet almost in the Old Testament mode.
This crusading friar's vision of invasion would come true. In 1494, Charles VIII, King of France, stood poised on the Tuscan border, ready to march through Italy with his army. Still made up of smaller republics, that were feuding among themselves, Italy was ripe for takeover. While Italy's builders had been creating monuments that exalted humanity, in this new age, they would dedicate their designs to war.
There is no such thing as a trained military engineer. And so it is that your greatest architects of the Renaissance, although sometimes they probably started out knowing nothing about it, were called upon to design the fortifications of major Italian cities.
Innovations and new technologies would now serve the military. The weapon of choice for Charles VIII was a fearsome new cannon. Medieval walls would crumble under its awesome firepower.
The cannon became much more reliable and also able to launch a projectile that was much larger, heavier, and to launch at a further distance. And so Charles VIII brings these cannon with him over the Alps, and it becomes immediately clear that he can knock down virtually any fortification that he chooses. And this is a terrible thing. I mean, this is a crisis, right? Because all of a sudden you can't hold them off.
Tall, thin medieval walls were easily penetrated and destroyed by the force of new cannons, giving Italian cities little protection. The outdated walls couldn't even support the weight of new weaponry to use against invaders.
The new cannon had strong percussive powers. You could not put a new cannon on the old medieval wall and fire it because it would shake its own wall down.
Italian engineers would turn their attention to designing a lower, thicker wall that would support the weaponry